They laughed when he said he'd fight them alone. 7 Germans against 1 Jug. By the time his guns went silent, 5 were falling from the sky. France, November 1943. The 56th Fighter Group briefing room smelled like sweat, coffee, and disbelief. The walls rattled every time a Thunderbolt took off outside. At the center of the map table stood First Lieutenant James "Red" Donovan, red hair slicked back with engine grease, flight jacket half-zipped, grin sharper than the knives of the Focke-Wulfs he'd soon face. He was tracing arcs across the operations chart with a pencil, his voice cutting through the chatter. They always dive in twos, right? We let them dive. Then we make them chase one of us down here. He tapped the map near Rouen. Low, fast. I climb through the clouds. They think they've got me boxed, but they're blind to what's above them. His wingmen exchanged looks. One laughed. You'll never climb fast enough, Red. That Jug's a flying anvil. You try to play bait. You're dead before you break cloud. Donovan didn't flinch. Then I better not miss. The room filled with snickers, nervous and cruel. Someone muttered, "He's going to get himself killed and take a P-47 with him." Red ignored them. He folded the map, slid it into his jacket, and walked out without another word. Outside, the morning sky was heavy with fog, the horizon faintly glowing pink. Ground crews loaded ammunition belts, 400 rounds per wing, while mechanics cursed at jammed turrets. As Donovan climbed into his Thunderbolt, one of the armorers called out, "You really going alone?" He smirked. "You ever try to share a sky with 6 Germans?" The engine roared to life. Dust and gravel scattered as the Jug rolled down the makeshift strip. At the end of the runway, Donovan pulled the yoke, and the plane clawed into the sky, vanishing into the clouds like a ghost. Minutes later in the radio tower, one of his squadron mates shook his head. "He's mad." Another replied, "He's red. That's worse." Up there, the air grew thin and bright. Donovan leveled off at 18,000 feet. Below him, a formation of black crosses sliced across the French countryside. Fw-190s, sleek, predatory, moving in perfect formation. He felt his pulse slow. "All right," he whispered. "Let's see if you can keep up." He nosed the Jug downward, throttle wide, engine screaming as the altimeter unwound. The airframe rattled. His guns armed themselves with a mechanical clack. At 5,000 feet, he leveled, inverted, and climbed straight into them. The Germans never saw him coming. The first Fw-190 burst into fire. 1 pass, 1 kill. Then the second spiraled down in smoke. Radio chatter exploded. "Eins, zwei, Achtung, oben!" Donovan rolled left, diving through the chaos. Bullets traced silver lines around him. He snapped the trigger again. 2 more hits. His cockpit shook, his breathing steady. Come on," he growled, yanking the stick, the Jug screaming against gravity. When it was over, 7 minutes had passed. The sky was silent. 5 German fighters were burning on the fields below. Donovan banked toward home, wings riddled, engine coughing, adrenaline fading. Over the radio came a single voice. "Red, do you read? You alive?" He exhaled. "I told you," he said, calm as stone. "Don't laugh at crazy till it shoots back." He'd done what no one believed possible, not just surviving alone, but rewriting the way Thunderbolt pilots would fight forever. The laughter had died with the echoes of his guns. Before Donovan's sortie, the rule of the air was sacred and simple. Stay in formation or die alone. Every U.S. fighter group drilled that into their bones. Tight formations meant shared firepower, mutual spotting, and moral safety. It was geometry as doctrine. Wings aligned, spacing measured in yards, a sky full of discipline. But that doctrine was written for bombers, not fighters. The air war over France in late 1943 was fast, fluid, and merciless. Fw-190s and Bf-109s attacked from above, then dove away before the Thunderbolts could react. Their Rotte, 2-plane teams, and Schwarm, 4-plane diamonds, gave them freedom to hunt, while the American formations moved like heavy machinery in thin air. The result was predictable and devastating. When the call came for evasive maneuvers, most pilots couldn't even turn without risking collision. "Stay tight," the manual said. "Keep your interval." But the Luftwaffe wasn't playing by the same rules. Donovan had seen it firsthand. Over Normandy, over Caen, over the Channel. Disciplined men dying because they couldn't break ranks fast enough to fight back. He called it formation death. In one briefing, after losing 2 new pilots in a single day, he slammed his helmet on the table and said, "We're not flying planes, we're flying coffins welded together." The room went quiet. Command didn't like that kind of talk. They called it defeatist, but the numbers backed him. In the first half of 1943, the average lifespan of a Thunderbolt pilot in Europe was just 12 missions. Losses weren't from cowardice or bad aim. They were from rigidity. German pilots, by contrast, treated combat like a chess match. They used cloud cover, altitude, and sun glare, hit hard, scatter, and reform elsewhere. It wasn't bravery. It was fluidity. But Allied brass wanted predictability. The U.S. Army Air Forces were building a system, not a culture. They needed control. Measurable, reportable, repeatable. What Donovan proposed, single-plane autonomy, was chaos to them. "Sir," he said once to his commanding officer, "the enemy knows how we fly before we take off." The CO frowned. "And you think flying alone fixes that?" "I think it keeps me alive." To him, dogfighting wasn't about teamwork. It was about instinct. He trusted his reflexes, not the system. The manual said, "One man cannot beat a squadron." But Donovan knew what the manuals didn't account for. The physics of surprise. Every fight was energy, momentum, altitude, gravity, drag. The one who broke the pattern first dictated the outcome. By flying solo, he wasn't being reckless. He was removing predictability from the equation. Still, to the rest of the 56th Fighter Group, it looked like madness. "You want to solo into a wolf pack?" one pilot said. "You'll be their breakfast," Donovan smirked. "Then I'll eat first." His philosophy wasn't arrogance. It was math wrapped in instinct. He believed that discipline without intuition turned pilots into statistics, that staying alive meant knowing when not to obey. Every ace started somewhere. His began the day he stopped asking permission to think. Before the war turned him into a legend, James "Red" Donovan was just another restless kid from Amarillo, Texas. Born in 1919 on a patch of sunburnt land west of town, he grew up surrounded by horses, dust, and the sound of wind whipping across barbed wire. His father ran cattle. His mother taught him to read by kerosene light. The only rule he remembered from home was simple. If it breaks, fix it. If it can't be fixed, ride around it. Red never liked rules that came in books. He learned by doing, and by falling. As a boy, he'd chase coyotes on horseback with a Winchester .30-30 balanced on his arm. He missed often, but when he hit, it was always dead center. By 17, he was racing trucks on dirt roads and tuning engines with nothing but instinct and a socket wrench. He was built for danger. People said he laughed too loud, fought too quick, and drove too fast. The sheriff once told him, "You'll either die before you're 30 or end up in the sky." Red had grinned. Why not both? When war broke out, he enlisted in the Army Air Corps. Flight training didn't suit him at first. Instructors hated his habit of improvising turns mid-drill. They wanted precision. He gave them personality. One instructor barked, "You think this is a rodeo?" Red replied, "Sir, that depends on who's chasing me." But even the instructors couldn't argue with results. He aced marksmanship and outflew men with twice his hours. During a live-fire gunnery test, he ignored the standard 200-yard engagement rule and waited until his target drone filled the gun sight. 3 bursts later, the fabric target shredded mid-air. The evaluator wrote, Excellent control, reckless timing, unteachable instincts. When the Thunderbolt entered service, Donovan fell in love. It wasn't elegant like a Spitfire or sleek like a Mustang. It was brutal, a bulldozer with wings. The P-47 didn't climb gracefully, but once it got moving, it could dive like a falling hammer and still fly home full of holes. Red admired that. "It's a brawler," he said, "just like me." He was transferred to the 56th Fighter Group in England in early 1943. By then, the Luftwaffe still dominated the skies of occupied France. Many American squadrons had never returned from their first missions. Donovan's early sorties were disasters. Tight formations, endless checklists, radio chatter that clogged the air. "War shouldn't sound like an office meeting," he muttered after losing a wingman to flak. But he noticed patterns others didn't. Germans attacked from above, dove, then zoomed away. The Thunderbolt couldn't turn with them, but it could absorb punishment and dive faster. He realized he didn't need to fight like them. He needed to fight differently. That was when the idea of solo slashing tactics began to take shape. It wasn't arrogance. It was adaptation. The manuals called it non-conforming engagement. He called it flying like a Texan. He spent nights sketching attack angles in the margins of maps, calculating dive speeds and timing altitude recoveries. No one took him seriously. To the brass, he was a nuisance. To his peers, a daredevil. But to himself, he was something simpler. A man who refused to die by the book. By the time he flew that fateful solo mission over Rouen, he wasn't just fighting Germans. He was fighting a system that worshipped control more than survival. And in war, the man who listens to the machine, not the manual, always finds a way to make both obey him. Wars aren't lost in the air. They're lost on paper, long before the first trigger's pulled. In 1943, the U.S. Army Air Forces didn't know it yet, but their math was killing pilots. Every Thunderbolt squadron flew under the same rigid doctrine, the Finger Four formation, borrowed from the Luftwaffe but stripped of its flexibility. It looked efficient, elegant even, but in practice it made American fighters predictable. The Luftwaffe studied it, mapped it, and waited. The statistics told the story no one wanted to read. Over France that summer, U.S. losses averaged 1 fighter per sortie in every 4-ship formation that met an enemy flight. Reaction times were 1.3 seconds too slow to evade initial dives. And when pilots tried to maintain radio discipline instead of shouting warnings, survival rates dropped another 10%. By September, the 56th Fighter Group had lost 29 pilots in 60 days. Not to mechanical failure, but to doctrine. Donovan saw the numbers and laughed, not out of disrespect, but disbelief. "We're dying by geometry," he said. "If the Krauts know where we'll be, they don't need to be better, just patient." He'd scribbled those figures into the back of his flight log under a single phrase: "Predictable men make perfect targets." Across the channel, the Germans had their own math. Their ace pilots, men like Walter Nowotny and Egon Mayer, taught their squadrons to exploit rhythm. Every formation had one, a pattern in speed, spacing, or altitude. "If you can time their breath," Mayer once wrote, "you can kill them before they exhale." Donovan didn't need the quote. He saw it every time a Thunderbolt spun down in smoke. The P-47 was powerful but heavy. It climbed slowly, turned sluggishly, and burned fuel like a tank. In a head-on or level fight, it was doomed. But in a dive, its turbocharged engine made it nearly unstoppable. A 10,000-pound missile with guns. The manuals told pilots to avoid solo combat at all costs. Donovan flipped that logic on its head. If the enemy expected you to be in formation, then flying alone made you invisible, an anomaly in their pattern recognition. He started collecting his own data. On patrols, he'd pull out a formation for seconds at a time, testing speed differentials, noting where radar lost contact. He realized the P-47's mass wasn't a weakness. It was a weapon. It could dive faster than anything in the sky and still pull up intact. He turned the math of defeat into the math of opportunity. A German Fw-190 could climb at 3,200 feet per minute. A Thunderbolt? Only 2,600. But in a dive, the P-47 could reach 500 mph before compressibility kicked in. Nearly 80 mph faster than the 190's limit. Donovan did the arithmetic in his head. If he could drop from 18,000 to 8,000 feet in 20 seconds, he'd hit firing range before they even reacted. If he could climb back through cloud within another 15, he'd disappear. One pass, one kill. That was the formula. What the manuals called recklessness, Donovan called mathematical aggression, the art of betting your life against seconds and physics. In the squadron logbooks, those seconds didn't mean much, but to him, each one was the difference between doctrine and death. The system didn't understand that. The Germans didn't expect it. And the sky? The sky didn't care. Only numbers told the truth up there. November 13th, 1943. Dawn over northern France. The air was gray, metallic, still. Lieutenant James Red Donovan climbed into his Thunderbolt, the engine coughing smoke like a waking dragon. His call sign crackled through the radio. Red 2, cleared for takeoff. He didn't answer. He was already rolling. Behind him, the rest of his flight waited for orders. But Donovan had already made his choice. No formation, no wingman. Just one man, one machine. And a storm waiting over Rouen. At 20,000 feet, the clouds opened like curtains. Below him, the earth was stitched with rivers and frost. Then his radar warning light flickered. Movement to the north, fast and low. 7 Fw-190s cutting across the countryside in a shallow dive. His heart rate slowed. The math began to speak. He throttled down to idle and tilted his plane nose first, gravity pulling the 10,000-pound jug toward the formation. Wind screamed past the canopy. The altimeter spun. 19,000, 15,000, 12,000. He armed his guns. 650 caliber Brownings waited in the wings, belts rattling with 400 rounds each. At 8,000 feet, the Germans saw him. Too late. He burst from the sun like a cannonball of silver and noise. The first Fw-190 didn't even turn. Donovan's tracers ripped through its fuselage, the cockpit exploding in a flash of magnesium. He pulled up into a climbing roll, bullets trailing his wake. The second German tried to chase him, diving to gain speed. Donovan flipped the jug on its back, cut throttle, and let the enemy overshoot. One squeeze of the trigger. Fire bloomed behind the propeller, 2 down. The radio crackled with distant chatter. Unidentified jug engaging. 7 contacts. Jesus Christ, he's alone. Donovan didn't hear it. The world had narrowed to wind, angle, and instinct. He saw 2 more shapes cutting across his path. He dove into them, opening fire at 400 yards. The third 190 shattered under a burst of armor-piercing incendiaries. The fourth tried to roll away, but caught a stream of tracers that tore its tail clean off. 4 kills in 90 seconds. The fifth came from luck, or destiny. Donovan's guns jammed mid-dive. He slammed the throttle, climbed, rolled, and came around behind the last fighter. The German pilot panicked, pulling into a vertical climb, fatal against a heavier opponent with a bigger engine. Donovan eased the trigger, the jam clearing with a metallic clack. The fifth kill streaked downward in fire, its pilot bailing out too late. Now it was just him, out of ammo, out of breath, surrounded by smoke. His gauges screamed, fuel low, oil pressure dropping, bullet holes in the right wing. But the jug still flew. Donovan leveled off, headed west toward the channel. Over the radio came the incredulous voice of his controller. Red 2, report status. You're alone up there. He laughed. A sharp, disbelieving sound that only the clouds could hear. Not anymore, he said. Below, 5 columns of black smoke marked the end of a German patrol. Back at base, his squadron waited on the tarmac, watching the speck of his Thunderbolt limp through the haze. The right aileron was half gone, holes stitched across the wings like scars. When he landed, his crew chief climbed onto the wing, speechless. What the hell happened up there? Donovan climbed down, wiped sweat and soot from his face, and said only, "Guess crazy works sometimes." His commanding officer would later call it an impossible engagement. Historians would call it the Rouen miracle. Donovan never called it anything. He just lit a cigarette, looked at the holes in his plane, and smiled. "Let the math sort it out," he said. The mission report filed that night ran just one paragraph long. Lieutenant James Donovan, unescorted, engaged 7 enemy fighters. 5 confirmed destroyed, 1 probable, 1 disengaged. Aircraft returned damaged but operational. No explanation, no engineering analysis, no mention of the impossible. But among the men who studied the film, the math told the real story. Donovan's Thunderbolt had entered combat at 19,000 feet and finished below 7,000. The dive profile indicated an average terminal velocity of 495 mph, just below compressibility, the point where control surfaces lock and planes fall apart. For comparison, the Fw-190D's safe limit was 417 mph. That 78 mph difference, the invisible margin between design and destruction, became Donovan's weapon. The Jug's massive airframe, mocked as overweight, had turned into an armor-plated spear. Engineers watching his gun camera film noted something else. His attack angles never repeated. No symmetry, no rhythm, no predictability. The Fw-190s couldn't form up because they couldn't understand the pattern, because there wasn't one. Doctrine said to engage in predictable passes. Level, stable, textbook perfect. Donovan's tactic defied every law of aerial coordination. Random velocity, variable altitude, rolling climbs. It was chaos turned into geometry. His squadron intelligence officer, Lieutenant Harlan Reed, wrote in the margin of his report, "This man fights like weather. Unpredictable but absolute." The results proved it. In 7 minutes of combat, he fired 1,143 rounds. Average engagement distance, 220 yards. Accuracy, 38%, nearly triple the squadron average. That kind of precision wasn't luck, it was muscle memory. To Donovan, combat was math expressed through feel. Altitude was currency, energy was momentum, and gravity was his co-pilot. He knew the P-47's flaws better than its designers. Its heavy roll rate, its sluggish climb, its turbo lag. But instead of fighting them, he used them. Where other pilots yanked at the stick to escape, he let go, letting the Jug fall through its own inertia before pulling up at the edge of blackout. He called it riding the weight. It was instinct, the kind born from rodeo reflexes and engine oil, not textbooks. The brass didn't like it. They called it reckless survivorship, a dangerous fluke that shouldn't be repeated. But behind closed doors, Republic Aviation's engineers asked for his flight data. They used his engagement to revise climb-dive recovery charts, expanding the Thunderbolt's operational dive envelope by 40 mph. In short, his defiance became doctrine. The irony didn't escape him. He once told a mechanic, "They write rules for how to fight after someone like me breaks them." But the deeper math, the kind you can't plot on a chart, was psychological. When word of Donovan's sortie spread through the 56th Fighter Group, something shifted. Younger pilots started flying looser, thinking faster, trusting instinct. They began bending the edges of their formations, pairing off, breaking early, moving like hunters instead of machines. Command noticed. Loss rates dropped, kill ratios climbed. And the formation myth, the belief that order alone guaranteed safety, started to crack. It wasn't just a story of one man against 7 enemies. It was the story of one instinct against a system. And that's how change happens in war. Not by permission, but by proof. Donovan didn't just survive his defiance. He made it quantifiable. He gave instinct a number. He gave chaos a trajectory. And he turned madness into a model that every ace after him would quietly imitate. When Donovan taxied in from his solo mission, his Thunderbolt looked like it had flown through a hurricane made of bullets. The right wing was shredded, 2 cylinders were misfiring, and the propeller blades were nicked to silver. Yet somehow the engine still growled. Mechanics swarmed the plane, shaking their heads. "She shouldn't be flying," one muttered. "Neither should he." That night, the mess hall was electric. The young pilots couldn't stop talking. 5 kills, someone whispered. 5, alone. Others dismissed it. "He got lucky. Next time he's a smoking hole." But behind the jokes, something had shifted. For months, they'd watched friends die sticking to rules that didn't work. Donovan had broken them, and lived. 2 days later, the group commander, Colonel Charles Gabreski, called a meeting. The officers packed the tent, tension humming like power lines. Gabreski, himself an ace, stared across the room at Donovan. "You went off mission. You disobeyed standing orders. You risked government property and human lives." Donovan folded his arms. "Yes, sir." Gabreski's eyes narrowed. "And you shot down 5 German fighters?" "Yes, sir." The colonel's jaw tightened. Then slowly he smiled. "Don't ever do it again." The room broke into laughter, the nervous kind that hides relief. Gabreski's grin faded. "But I want to see that gun camera footage." They projected the 16mm reel on the briefing wall that night. The room fell silent. Every pilot in the tent leaned forward as Donovan's Thunderbolt dove from the sun, tracers cutting perfect diagonal arcs through enemy wings. When the 5th Focke-Wulf exploded, someone let out a low whistle. "That's not flying," one pilot whispered. "That's art." The footage spread across the 56th like wildfire. Pilots began experimenting, stretching formation gaps, practicing solo slashes, diving from odd angles. Red style, they called it. At first, command resisted. Reports came in complaining of formation fragmentation and undisciplined engagements. But the results spoke louder than reprimands. Loss rates fell by 20% in a single month. Pilots were fighting smarter, not tighter. A young lieutenant named Joe Levine tried it during a patrol over Lille. When 2 Bf-109s ambushed his section, Levine peeled off early, broke formation, and dropped like a stone. He hit one at 400 yards, pulled up through the smoke, and rejoined formation. "I flew like Red," he radioed, laughing. Even skeptics began to notice. Donovan's methods weren't luck. They were repeatable. Within weeks, the solo slash became unofficial doctrine. Pilots started leaving gaps between elements, 5 seconds, then 10, enough to act independently if attacked. The Germans didn't know what hit them. Their timing collapsed. Behind closed doors, even the analysts had to admit it. "Statistical anomaly repeated across multiple sorties," one report read. "Recommend tactical review." Donovan didn't ask for credit. He didn't care about memos. He just cared that the boys who'd laughed at him were coming home. One night, as they cleaned their guns under lamplight, a younger pilot asked him, "Why do you always go alone?" He smiled, flicked a cigarette into the dark, and said, "Because when you're alone, you don't wait for permission to survive." The tent went quiet. Outside, the air hummed with the sound of distant engines. The next mission spinning up, another sky waiting to be rewritten. And in every cockpit that took off the next morning, somewhere between fear and faith, one thought lingered. If Red can do it, maybe I can too. January 1944. The Ardennes. The cold bit through leather jackets, and frost clung to the canopy glass like film grain on reality. The war had shifted. Now every flight across occupied Europe carried a new layer of risk. The Luftwaffe wasn't dying quietly. It was adapting, more aggressive, more desperate, and just as deadly. The 56th Fighter Group was tasked with escorting bombers to Cologne, a milk run on paper, suicide in the sky. Intelligence warned of 12 Bf-109s sweeping the corridor near Liège. Donovan, now unofficially leading Red Section, briefed his men before takeoff. "If they bounce us, don't tighten up. Scatter, dive, climb, and fight them like they fight us. Make the sky too damn big to control." The others nodded, trusting his instincts more than the manual. At 17,000 feet, the first contrails appeared. Thin white scratches moving against the sun. "Tally-ho!" radio crackled. 12 109s diving fast. Donovan's men spread out in pairs, breaking formation early. What followed wasn't a dogfight. It was an eruption. The German leaders screamed through the formation, guns blazing, expecting the usual tight American box. Instead, there was nothing, only empty sky. Before he could react, Donovan came in from above at 480 miles/hour, cutting across the sun. His 650s tore through the first 109's canopy. Smoke burst from its wing as the pilot bailed out, his chute freezing instantly in the winter air. "Red one, splash one!" Another German dove on his tail, but this time a young lieutenant named Lavin, flying Red 2, swooped in from the opposite angle. One squeeze, one clean burst. The 109 disintegrated mid-turn. "Red 2, kill confirmed," Donovan laughed into the mic. "That's it, boys. Chaos is our wingman." For the next 7 minutes, the sky became math in motion. Thunderbolts dove, climbed, and rolled with no pattern the enemy could read. Every American pilot fought like his own wolf pack, striking fast and vanishing into cloud. The Germans tried to regroup, but coordination collapsed. Each time they reformed, another P-47 appeared out of nowhere, slicing through formation with a burst of tracers. When it was over, 6 109s were down. The rest fled north. No Thunderbolts lost. The radio stayed silent for a long moment. Then Lavin's voice cracked through, trembling with adrenaline. "Red, you crazy bastard. It worked." Donovan grinned behind his oxygen mask. "Told you," he said. "Rules don't win dogfights. Angles do." They landed to stunned mechanics and speechless brass. One colonel muttered, "That wasn't a formation. That was a storm." Word spread faster than orders could suppress it. The second storm, they called it. A battle where instinct, not hierarchy, ruled the sky. Within days, tactical memorandums began quietly circulating across Allied airfields. Decentralized engagement flexibility was the new phrase, a bureaucratic way of admitting Donovan had been right. But in the debrief room, he didn't look triumphant, just tired. A young pilot approached him after the mission. "Sir, why'd you risk it again? You already proved your point." Donovan stared at the floor, then out the window toward the horizon, streaked red by the setting sun. "Because the next kid who flies up there deserves to come back down." He walked away before anyone could answer. Outside, a mechanic ran a hand along the bullet holes in his Thunderbolt's wings. "How does it keep flying like this?" The crew chief smiled faintly. "Because he does." The legend of the second storm would spread from the Ardennes to every briefing room in Europe. Pilots would quote his words, trace his flight paths, and whisper his call sign before missions like a talisman. Red Donovan had turned a suicide flight into a blueprint for victory. And he'd done it not by rewriting the manual, but by ignoring it. By spring 1944, Donovan's name had become both a legend and a problem. The 56th Fighter Group was now one of the most feared units in the 8th Air Force, its kill ratio climbing from 1.1 to nearly 4.0 to 1 in just 3 months. Command loved the numbers, but hated the reason behind them. Reports poured in from across Europe. P-47 squadrons were breaking formation early, using dispersed interception and rapid slashing tactics, both unofficial, both copied from Donovan's methods. The Army called it unauthorized decentralization. The pilots called it survival. The math didn't lie. In April alone, the 56th flew 812 sorties and lost only 19 aircraft, down from 47 the previous quarter. Average engagement time per kill dropped from 4.5 minutes to 1.8. Pilots returned with fewer bullet holes, fewer wingmen missing, fewer letters written home. Discipline hadn't saved them. Freedom had. Donovan's defiance had evolved into a system, the anti-system. Commanders began quietly teaching his principles during briefings. Engage unpredictably, control altitude as currency. Let the enemy burn energy first. The textbooks caught up months later, repackaged as energy maneuvering tactics. Official history credited the doctrine to engineers at Wright Field. Unofficially, every pilot knew the truth. It came from the red-headed cowboy who refused to fly straight. When Donovan read one of those memos, he laughed so hard he nearly fell off his bunk. Energy management, he said. That's just fancy talk for flying by feel. He wasn't wrong. Behind the myth, though, there was where the war had carved him down. 5 confirmed kills in one mission, 3 more in January, and dozens of sorties since. Each flight carried the same weight, a sky full of rules he refused to follow. The brass tried to rein him in. "You're not a system," one colonel said. "You're an accident waiting to happen." Donovan grinned. "Then let me crash where it counts." He never did. He kept flying, kept breaking patterns, kept teaching new pilots how to think instead of follow. "Don't memorize the sky," he told them. "Listen to it." His words outlasted him. When the war ended, the U.S. Air Force officially adopted loose pair tactics for the next generation of fighters, the same madman's methods that turned chaos into victory. Historians would later write that the Allied air war succeeded because of superior numbers, superior machines, superior logistics. All true, but incomplete. What they missed were the men who turned those advantages into something human. The men who looked at doctrine and said, "Not today." Donovan didn't win the war by himself, but his math of defiance changed the rhythm of it. The Germans called their pilots Flieger. The Americans had something different, wild cards. Men who fought by feel, by nerve, by instinct sharpened in a single heartbeat. And if you trace the lineage of every modern air combat manual, every energy fight and slash attack, every lesson on unpredictability, you'll find it ends in the same place, a gray sky over Rouen, a single P-47 streaking downward through fire and disbelief. Because that's where one man's madness became everyone else's method. Because that's where a laugh turned into a law. When the war ended, the sky went quiet. No more missions, no more radio chatter, no more laughter before takeoff. Lieutenant James Red Donovan packed his duffel, turned in his sidearm, and walked away from the flight line without ceremony. No medal awaited him, just silence and the echo of engines that no longer roared. He went home to Amarillo, back to dust and barbed wire. The war had taken his youth, but left him a strange gift, a lifetime's worth of reflexes and ghosts. He bought a small ranch outside town and built a makeshift airstrip from packed dirt. Locals called it Red's Runway. Sometimes kids from the nearby farms would watch him taxi an old surplus AT-6 Texan across the field, throttle up and vanish into the sky. He'd fly alone, always alone. Neighbors said he'd circle for hours, looping and diving like he was back over France. One kid asked him once, "Mister, why don't you fly straight?" Donovan smiled under his hat. "Son," he said, "flying straight gets you shot." He never bragged about his record. The stories came from others, from the pilots who lived because of him, from the men who rewrote tactics based on his gun camera film. He never corrected them, never signed autographs. The only mark he ever left was on the aluminum of his plane, where he'd scratched 3 words near the cockpit in knife-edge letters. "Crazy saved me." Decades later, an aviation historian tracked him down for an interview. By then, Donovan was an old man with hands like cracked leather and eyes still bright as engine flame. When asked how he'd known his plan would work, he chuckled. "Didn't," he said. "But I knew if I stayed predictable, I'd die polite." The interviewer pressed him. "What was your secret?" He paused, stared at the horizon where the sky met the plains, and said, "You can't outfly fear, but you can make it chase you instead." In 1972, when he passed away, His ashes were scattered from a restored P-47 flown by one of his old wingmen. As the silver fighter banked over the Texas desert, sunlight caught the wings, the same kind of light that once glinted over Normandy, over Rouen, over the lives he changed. The pilots who flew that day said the air felt different, as if the sky itself remembered him. Red Donovan never became a general, never got his picture on a recruiting poster, but his fingerprints were in every cockpit that came after him, every F-86 Sabre that dueled over Korea, every Phantom over Vietnam, every modern jet that fights with the same gospel he preached. Don't be predictable. Don't wait for permission to survive. Some legends fade. His just climbs. Because every pilot who's ever broken formation, who's ever trusted instinct over order, who's ever turned into the sun instead of away from it, carries a little of Red Donovan's defiance in their blood. He didn't just teach men to fly. He taught them how to think. And in the end, that's how you change the sky.